Hello everyone, it's Autumn Johnson checking in for March Madness Women's Basketball, and it is bracket time. The selection committee just announced the March Madness Women's Basketball bracket. I have it right here. I'm going to fill it out from my first round picks all the way up into my champion, who I think will become victorious overall. We have a complete show in store for you. We're going to talk about the top 16, the strongest region, I think, and then first round matchups, some first timers. I'm going to fill out my bracket as I mentioned, and then I'm going to tell you my champion. I'm excited to get started, so let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to go region by region and take it all the way from there, describe a little bit of my picks and why I'm going in that direction, and I'm going to give you some tips of how you can, pick yours as well. But let's go ahead and dive in. I have in Greenville 1, starting off South Carolina, Norfolk State. I'm going with the champs, South Carolina first. And then 8 and 9 matchup, South Florida versus Marquette. I'm going South Florida. We got a 5-12 matchup, Oklahoma versus Portland. I'm going Oklahoma. UCLA, number 4, going up against number 13, Sacramento State. I'm going UCLA on this one. We got Creighton, Illinois, and Mississippi State. So that's going to be our first 4 teams. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and pick Illinois, taking down Mississippi State. So I have them advancing first, going up against Creighton, and we'll get to that very shortly of why I have Illinois upsetting Creighton. We have Notre Dame taking on Southern Utah. I'm going with Notre Dame. Arizona versus West Virginia. I'm going Arizona. We got Maryland versus Holy Cross. I got Maryland. And then, of course, back up at the top, South Carolina over South Florida. Let's see, Oklahoma versus UCLA. This one's going to be a really great matchup. I really love Oklahoma's offense, but I love how hot UCLA has been going all the way to the Pac-12 championship game. So I'm going UCLA. We got a possible rematch here, South Carolina versus UCLA. I'm going South Carolina. We'll get into these very shortly and break them down a little bit further, but I'm taking you all the way to the Final Four at this point. We got Illinois versus Notre Dame. Now, if Olivia Miles is healthy and she'll play, I'm going with Notre Dame for this one. All right, we got Arizona versus Maryland. I'm going with the number 2 seed, Maryland. And then Notre Dame versus Maryland. This one was really tough for me, but I'll get into it a little bit shortly. I'm going to go with Maryland for this one, which could be another rematch we saw earlier this season. Let's take a little break, a little pause on this region. That's how I have it shaking out so far. That's my Greenville 1 and how I'm rocking for this bracket. But in general, I really like how this shakes out. Of course, South Carolina on that 38-game winning streak as of late. They are one of the hottest teams right now in the entire nation. I don't see anyone stepping in front of them, so I'm excited to see if they can run it back and bring a 3rd title in Columbia. But Greenville 1, as I mentioned, UCLA will be a hosting seed so far. When we saw the selection committee make their picks of the top 16 on February 23rd, this was a team that wasn't mentioned. But going into that Pac-12 game, coming all the way to the championship game, taking down a Stanford team, which is very, very, very a huge upset that we saw. I see this team doing a lot of damage, especially going up against Oklahoma. I mentioned Notre Dame possibly making it to the Sweet 16 if we see a return of Olivia Miles. Illinois, this one was a surprise to me to see Illinois as an 11 seed. I thought Shauna Green did an incredible job, making sure that her team made a complete 180 in her program, but I think this is going to be a sleeper so far. Illinois, I think they're going to take it over Creighton, considering the fact that Creighton has went up and down all season long, and we're going to see if they can have that upset so far. And then a rematch, as I mentioned, South Carolina versus UCLA, South Carolina versus Maryland. So right now, we have our hosting seeds. We'll see South Carolina, Maryland, Notre Dame, and UCLA. And that's how it shakes out. Right now, for my Final Four pick, I'm going South Carolina. No surprise there. We'll jump back into South Carolina a little bit later. Now let's go over to Greenville 2. For our hosting seeds, we have Indiana, we have Utah, LSU, and also Villanova. So let's go ahead and start filling this side out. At the top, I'm going Indiana. Oklahoma State versus Miami. I'm going with Miami. They have some quality wins throughout the course of the season. Washington State versus FGCU. This one was really tough for me considering the fact that both of these two teams are sleepers in the NCAA tournament. Washington State, one of the hottest teams in the nation, taking down tons of Pac-12 foes to become the first ever Pac-12 champs in program history. They're going up against an experienced squad in FGCU who is consistently in the NCAA tournament. And they gave many people a run for their money, taking down Virginia Tech last year in the first round, but ran up against a scary Maryland team. For this one, even though Washington State is a hungry and scary team, I'm going with FGCU due to the fact that I just think they have a little bit more shooters in there compared to Washington State, a little bit more balance, a scoring balance for this team. So I'm going to take the experience and the depth of FGCU to take it that way. Let's go ahead. Villanova and Cleveland State. Villanova. Even though Villanova is in the top 25, I still think this team is slept on. Michigan versus UNLV, a 6-11 matchup. I'm going with Michigan. We got LSU versus Hawaii. Very excited about this one. I'm going with LSU. NC State versus Princeton, a 7-10 battle. Whew. All right, this is where things shake up for me, and it was a tough one, but considering the roller coaster ride of a season that NC State has had, I'm going with an upset right here. Rocking with Princeton, the Ivy League champs right here, who I think are going to make some noise. Utah versus Gardner-Webb. I'm doing Utah, number 2 seed. Let's see. All right. This is where it gets a little tricky. I think this is a very strong region. Indiana, Miami. I have Indiana right here. Whew. FGCU versus Villanova. I have this as a sleeper team. So I'm going to go ahead and do FGCU right here. We'll get into that later. Michigan. LSU, I'm going with LSU. Princeton, Utah. Going with Utah. And we'll dive into these a little bit later. But let's just go ahead and fill out this region. I have LSU advancing to the Elite 8. And then Indiana doing the same. And for my Final Four team, I'm rocking with Indiana. I'll go a little bit further into this region, just a little bit. But let's go ahead and go into Seattle 3. And we'll move through this. Virginia Tech. Over Chattanooga. I'll explain why later. We got Southern California versus South Dakota State. Very exciting matchup. For this one, I'm going with the sleeper pick, South Dakota State. We got Iowa State versus Toledo. I'm going with the Big 12 champs. Tennessee versus St. Louis. Rocking with Tennessee. North Carolina, Purdue. Now this is another playing game. So right here, I'm going with Big Ten's Purdue. They are a sleeper, a scary team who have taken down some quality foes this season and gave them a run for their money. But when it comes down to it, I'm going to give North Carolina the edge. We're going to fill this out and break it down later. Ohio State versus James Madison. Ohio State will be my pick. We have Baylor versus Alabama. I'm going with Baylor. UConn, Vermont. Going with UConn, which I'll get into this one. We got an exciting matchup down low. Possible rematch. All right, Virginia Tech. I'm giving them the edge over South Dakota State. Tech. Iowa State versus Tennessee. Ooh, going with Tennessee with this one. I like how the Vols are playing as of late. Ohio State versus North Carolina. I'm going with the Buckeyes. Baylor versus UConn, giving UConn the edge. And then back up at the top, Virginia Tech versus Tennessee, a rematch, possible rematch, if it all shakes out how I think it will. Virginia Tech. Ohio State versus UConn. Huskies is my pick. Now for Final Fours, who's advancing? Virginia Tech. So right now, yes, I do have all 1 seeds, but this is where it shakes up. Moving into Seattle 4. We'll break this region down a little bit more when we fill it all out. But moving on over, number 1, Stanford, having another playing game. We have Southern University versus Sacred Heart. For this matchup, I'm going to go with Sacred Heart, the NEC champs. So I'm going to go ahead and circle that. But I have Stanford taking them down. 8 and 9 matchup, Ole Miss versus Gonzaga. I have Ole Miss. Louisville versus Drake. Got another sleeper pick. Going with Drake. I'll explain this later. We got Texas versus East Carolina. Going with Texas. Colorado, a 6-11 matchup. Middle Tennessee, another sleeper pick right here. Going with Middle Tennessee. And then Duke and Iona. I'm going with Duke for this one. A 7-10 matchup, always the fun matchups that we have. I'm going to go with Georgia, the lower seed in this one. Iowa versus Southeastern Louisiana. I'm going with Iowa. Back up at the top, Stanford versus Ole Miss. I'm advancing the Cardinal. Drake versus Texas. I'm going to go with Texas for this one. We saw this regular season matchup last season. Middle Tennessee versus Duke. I think the Cinderella story ends there. Duke's defense is incredible. Georgia versus Iowa. I'm really excited for this matchup. I'm going with Iowa. I think that will be a fun one to tune into if it all shakes out. I think it will. Still giving Stanford the edge. And I think they're going to run into Iowa when it all comes down to it. And here's where it shakes up. I really love how Iowa is playing as of late. So I'm going to have Iowa, a 2 seed, in my Final Four. Let's go ahead and fill in those two. South Carolina versus Iowa. This was a matchup that we all wanted last year when they were in the same region. However, Iowa had an early exit last year, was defeated by Creighton, but I think this is the year that Iowa pushes through and gets that edge over Stanford. But going up against South Carolina, you are going against a top defense in the nation. Iowa possesses one of the top offenses in the nation. It's going to be exciting to see. You'll have Monica Czinano go up against Aaliyah Boston, the defending National Player of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year last year. Those are 2 efficient posts, arguably the best posts in the entire nation. So I'm excited to see those 2 battle it out. But what I'm really looking forward to is the guard play. I'm excited to see Caitlin Clark, and I'm excited to see possibly Bree Bill take on that defensive assignment going up against Iowa. Bree Bill always has the toughest defensive assignments, and she is up for the contender as a National Defensive Player of the Year. She is trying to accomplish that, and I think we'll see that very shortly. And considering that I think South Carolina is going to be my champs, I already gave that little teaser that I have them advancing into the championship game. Moving on to the other side. This one was hard for me because I love both teams. Both teams right now playing very hot as of late. Indiana stumbled a little bit in the Big Ten tournament, had an early exit. They were the regular season champs, thought they could take it all the way, but ran into a tough team, stumbled a little bit against Michigan State, and then just couldn't get it done. But going up against Virginia Tech, I'm excited to see the history that this team continues to make. The big three of Elizabeth Kitley, you have Georgia Amore, Taylor Soule, all coming in and helping this team have an 11-game winning streak. They are the ACC champs for the first time in program history. However, with Indiana's balance, depth, and tough defense, they have veteran guards when you look at their guard play, but then also a very efficient post in Mackenzie Holmes. I'm going to take Indiana in the championship game. Will we possibly see Mackenzie Holmes versus Aaliyah Boston? We also have Grace Berger versus Zaya Cook. There's so many elite stars in this matchup. I already teased it. My champs, South Carolina. All right, we already kind of went through my Greenville 1 and some of the rematches that I saw, but let's go ahead and talk about some of the storylines that we have in Greenville 2. This one was a lot of upsets. FGCU making it all the way to the Sweet 16. I just love the veteran experience of this squad. They have a lot of shooters, a lot of three-point shooters at that kind of overpower Villanova, who they would run up against. And Villanova has a National Player of the Year contender in Maddie Siegrist. She is on a streak right now with 20-plus wins or 20-plus points for her. So limiting her will be key. But I think the offensive star power that FGCU overpowers this team, and I'll have them going up against Indiana. I'm excited to see what Michigan versus LSU would look like if we do get that matchup. I did kind of struggle on this one with UNLV having a 22-game winning streak. They are a sleeper team in this bracket, so that would be fun to see if Michigan or UNLV makes it out in that one. Utah looking strong, finishing as the co-champs in the Pac-12. And when it's all said and done, Indiana becomes victorious overall. As for Seattle 3, let's move into some storylines over here. We could possibly have a 2021 rematch between Baylor and UConn. That was one of the first things that I saw. We saw how that game ended in one possession game, and in that one, UConn took it all. Let's see if Baylor can get their redemption, but I think with the healthy UConn team, you got AZ Fudd back, you got Nika Mule. This was a team that had a lot of adversity and didn't have their full team going down the stretch, had a couple of slip-ups, 5 losses throughout the entire season. Very uncharacteristic for the Huskies, but with the full team and full strength going into March, I think this is going to be a dangerous team when it's all said and done. And if we get that matchup, that would just be an iconic team. I mean, a team that possesses so many championships. Baylor is a new team that we saw in 2021. No Dejanay Carrington. We don't have Nalissa Smith, but a lot of stars. And Jada Owens, of course, Sarah Andrews. This team is locked and loaded. So I'm excited to see if we get this battle once again. Speaking of injuries, Ohio State is another team I'm going to be looking at. JC Sheldon is back. She helped push her team to the Big Ten championship game. Ran up against a hot Iowa team. So let's see if they can continue to make it, because I have them going all the way to the Sweet 16, something they did last year as well. And they run that full court press every single time, which will make them a dangerous contender. And for the most part, South Dakota State, Southern California, 2 sleeper teams that are going up against each other. I think South Dakota State was battle tested in the non-conference, which will help them coming into March. They played a lot of tough teams this entire season. They played Creighton, Mississippi State, UCLA, Louisville, which they won in that game. Also Kansas State, they won in that game. They played South Carolina, the defending national champs, and also Washington State. So they have that experience of playing these tough teams. So I think that has prepared them for March, and they're going to need it going up against possibly Virginia Tech. And that could be a possible Cinderella story if they can continue to advance and move on. Now, Virginia Tech and Tennessee could possibly be a rematch that we saw on December 4th. So far, Virginia Tech won in that battle by 3 points. That was without Rakia Jackson. She is now back, a scoring nightmare for Tennessee. She can score on all three levels. And also Tamari Key was in that matchup guarding Elizabeth Kitley, the back-to-back ACC Player of the Year. So with those two factors, I still have Virginia Tech advancing in this matchup. So excited to see if that plays out. Virginia Tech looking very hot with an 11-game winning streak, but I just think that edge goes to Indiana with the balanced attack that they have on both ends, defense and offense. Now let's break down Seattle 4 just a little bit further. Some of the biggest storylines I'm looking out for is Texas advancing to the Sweet 16. This is a team that has went back-to-back in the Elite Eight twice, and they're looking to do that again. However, Stanford stands in the way, meeting them in the Sweet 16. If they can get past Stanford, I think they can take it all the way, possibly, and they'll have to go up against an Iowa team. We'll have a defensive battle versus an offensive battle of what they possess and their strengths. But overall, I think Stanford's going to get that battle, but it's tough to say. There's great teams. So far, I think this region is the toughest, considering you have a Stanford, Texas, Duke, Iowa compared to the rest. I also like the strength that Seattle 3 has, but when it's all said and done, I think this one is the toughest region. It's hard to see who's going to come out of it because you have all these top caliber teams and how it all shakes out. But it'll be exciting to see if Texas can make it a three-peat to the Elite Eight. That's one of the biggest storylines that I'll be watching out for. Also, Iowa-Duke will be a rematch in the regular season that we saw last year. Duke actually got the best of this matchup, but this was during a time that Iowa was going through a rough spell, a roller coaster ride of the season, but was able to shake it out down the stretch and became the Big Ten champs. So when it's all said and done, my Final Four: South Carolina, Indiana, Iowa, Virginia Tech, and then in my championship games, South Carolina and Indiana. And overall, South Carolina wins it all. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp it, go ahead and sign it. You heard it here first. There is my signature. This is what I'm sticking by. It is set in stone. That is going to be my March Madness bracket. You guys can do the same by going to NCAA.com and filling out your bracket as well to complete your champion. But I think this is going to be really exciting when it's all said and done. I can't wait to see what teams continue to advance and go forward. We have a lot of teams that are looking to get in for the first time, and also some new teams in some new places. We have Indiana and Virginia Tech sitting as 1 seeds for the first time ever. Utah sitting as a 2 seed. There's also 4 teams featured in the bracket for the first time. So a lot of history, a lot of stories that we'll see very soon. The first round matchups that I'm looking forward to, if we look into this region, first of all, we have a lot of Power 5 conferences facing off against each other. And in general, the first thing I'm looking at is Arizona versus West Virginia, which will be fun to watch. And that's a Pac-12 versus Big 12 matchup. Going down, I'm excited to see Ole Miss versus Gonzaga in the first round. Louisville versus Drake is a sleeper matchup that I think will be fun to watch. We also have Florida State versus Georgia, which is an ACC matchup versus SEC. Over in Greenville, too, possibly having Washington State versus FGCU, 2 sleepers teams. You got the Pac-12 facing the ASUN. Oklahoma State versus Miami. That's a great Big 12 versus ACC matchup. And looking down, Princeton, as I mentioned, could be a sleeper team that makes their way through and powers their way. Down in Seattle 3, let's see, we have, let's see. Oh, yes, Baylor versus Alabama would be a Big 12 versus SEC matchup. So there's a lot of Power 5 matchups in the first round that we could possibly see. Make sure you tune in. The madness starts very soon. We're going to have our first 4 matchups start on March 15th and 16th. So make sure you tune in to all of the madness. But that is a wrap. This is my bracket. I am Autumn Johnson for March Madness Women's Basketball. Thank you all for tuning in.